Hello, I'm Jason Walls here with interest.co.nz, and I'm here with Arthur Grimes, who's an economics of well-being expert, just here to gauge his opinion on the government's intention to add well-being into the budget in 2019. I suppose let's just start off quite broadly. What is economics of well-being?
Well, the economics of well-being is essentially designing economic policies and other policies, social policies, to make people's lives better. Not necessarily to give them higher incomes, that may be part of it, but to have aspects of policy and aspects of people's lives that make them feel better about themselves.
And as I understand it, this has never really been implemented anywhere else in the world. So why hasn't it been?
Well, it's not been implemented in central government as such, although it has been attempted. It's been implemented more at local government level. The UK has well-being in their local government legislation, and New Zealand had the 4 well-beings in its previous local government legislation until the last government took them out. That was economic well-being, social well-being, personal well-being, human well-being if you like, and environmental well-being. These were the 4 well-beings that were part of the central part of the local government legislation under the earlier Labour government.
And so why was it that the previous government took them out, do you think?
Well, I think they thought that local governments should, what they thought is stick to their knitting, sort of footpaths and water and things like that, and rather than thinking that they should have a broader role in improving people's well-being.
And so that now the new government is looking to implement that, so what exactly, you mentioned a few things of what it's going to look like, but how does that differ from the local government level?
Well, at this stage we don't quite know, because it's an early stage with the central government now. And what I think we're going to be finding with the Treasury's excellent work they're doing in this area is how do we actually get the broad concept of well-being, which is a sensible concept, how do we actually make that operational? And what we've seen in the past in other countries is real fascinating attempts to look at this. President Sarkozy of France set up the famous commission led by Stiglitz, Sen and Fitoussi, 2 Nobel Prize winners plus a very famous French economist who wrote a very, very famous report in this area on economics of well-being. And then following that, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister of the UK, also set up a very high-powered commission to look at how well-being could be the centrepiece of the UK's economic policy. Unfortunately, that committee, I think, went pretty much by the by as David Cameron went by the by. So it hasn't really been implemented either in the UK or in France up to this stage, and it'll be very interesting to see how it's implemented here. Right,
so it has been attempted before. So how do you think that the Treasury and the government might look at some of those other examples and work that into some of the things that they're trying to do?
Well, I think that's what they're trying to work out at the moment. There are different ways that one could do it. One could start as the current Treasury is doing, and start from what they think of as the key sort of capitals in the economy: natural capital, social capital, human capital, and physical capital, machines and buildings and the like, and then think about how they might then contribute to people's well-being. And that's very much the focus of the framework that the Treasury has at the moment, and that to some extent the OECD has as well. The OECD has also done fantastic work in this field. Other people start directly from subjective well-being itself, measures of how people feel about themselves, and then work to see what it is that has the biggest impact on people's subjective well-being. And that's the approach of many of the people, for instance, in Britain around the London School of Economics, who's doing fantastic work in this field. At the moment, the Treasury is preferring the natural capital, the social and natural, human, environmental capital approach. And it'll be interesting to see how they marry that up with the ultimate sort of measures of well-being, about basically how people feel about themselves.
And if you were to give some advice to Treasury about when it's looking at its frameworks and what to include, what would your advice to them be?
Well, I think the capitals approach is fantastic from a sustainability angle, but I'd really like to see that married with what is it that we know from the literature and the research that makes what policies make people feel really better about themselves. And we know from the literature, especially in the UK, that money spent, for instance, on mental health activities probably has the biggest bang for the buck in terms of subjective well-being, making people's lives better. That's the kind of approach I would really like to see cemented in here. But we've yet to see whether that will be.
And so what about some of the criticisms about this, that it's just a bit of window dressing and it's not really going to amount to much? I mean, at the end of the day, what will it actually be?
It has the potential to amount to a lot. It also has the potential to be window dressing. And I think that's going to be the really hard test of both the Treasury's work and the government's is to see how they really tie it down and say, these policies here that we're implementing, we think will make people's lives better through this mechanism to this degree. And I think we can get the mechanisms right. We can think of how things will work. To this degree is going to be really problematic. And that's why I like the approach that people, for instance, at the LSE have taken in London, saying, how do we measure how much this policy will affect people's actual well-being?
New Zealand's quite a rich country when it comes to GDP, and we have quite a good standards of life. So does this make this almost the perfect testing ground for something like the economics of well-being and implementing it into legislation, do you think?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, yes, we came out well in averages. On average quality of life, I think we're sort of 8th in the world on the Gallup poll, maybe 20th on GDP. So our quality of life is better than our incomes, if you like. But we're a pretty unequal society on both those measures, both in terms of incomes and in terms of well-being. We have a large variability in our well-being, much larger than, say, the European social democracies. And I think the biggest test for me of the well-being framework will be how it actually narrows the difference in people's well-being, the inequalities in our well-being, rather than necessarily the average level.
And how long do you think it would take before we actually start seeing some results and start sort of changing some of the things that you've said?
Well, I'd like to see some of the budget bids, for instance, in 2019 being specifically made around how this will contribute to people's subjective well-being, and how does it make, when we look at how people feel about themselves, will this make a difference, and what is the literature showing that? I think we could have the potential to do that as from next year. And
so that's going to drive a lot of policy, do you think, that when they look at the numbers?
I think it can do. Whether it will do or not, of course, is another question.
Excellent place to leave it. Well, thank you very much for coming along, and thank you very much for watching. This has been Arthur Grimes, Jason Walls for interest.co.nz.